ask you, do you believe this is the Word of God? Do you believe it's true? Do you believe it's historically accurate, reliable? Why?
Good question. Join Dr. Bo Kirkwood as he reviews the evidences from McDowell's book and anchors our faith in God's book. Now, Dr. Bo Kirkwood.
But today, we're going to take a look at something that's called the mystery religions. Now, you may not have heard of some of this, but it's out there, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. It was briefly alluded to, I think, in chapter 5 of Strobel's book that I gave you, asked you to get. And then it's also in one of his other books, Jesus, the Real Jesus, the Case for the Real Jesus. A lot of this is in there. But this stuff has kind of been out there for a long time. And it had its beginnings probably in the 19th century more than any time else. And it's the idea that Christianity is a borrowed religion, that everything in Christianity really, there's nothing novel about it, and it was around for many, 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 many years, hundreds and hundreds of years, and that all that Christians did is they just borrowed from these other quote-unquote mystery religions. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the mystery religions. And like I said, some of this comes from as way back as the 19th century from Kersey Graves, the world's 16 crucified saviors. And we're not going to look at all 16 of them, but there's a list of 16 saviors. Now, most of these crucified saviors were myths. They weren't real people, okay? That's what's kind of silly about it. They were gods or goddesses and so forth. They weren't real people. But he wrote this book, and it garnered some attention. And then more recently, you have Timothy Freak, which we mentioned these guys last week. Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, who wrote the Jesus Mysteries and Jesus and the Lost Goddess, which perpetuate this nonsense, and that's what it is. It's absolute nonsense, but they've perpetuated that. And then you even have a guy by the name of Tom Harper from the Pagan Christ. Again, they borrowed from pagan religions, and that's where Christianity, the things that we learn about baptism and crucifixion and the resurrection and all of that is borrowed from pagan religions. And he says there's nothing that Jesus or the Gospels either said or did that cannot be shown to have originated thousands of years before in Egyptian mystery rites and other sacred liturgies. That's the claim. This is from the Jesus Mysteries. And they say, why should we consider the story of Osiris, Dionysus, Adonis, Attis, Mithras, and the other pagan mystery saviors as fables, yet come across essentially the same story told in a Jewish context and believe it to be the biography of a carpenter from Bethlehem? So what's the deal? Why would we believe that when we don't believe these others? We come across these fables and these stories all over these mystery religions and these gods and so forth that are listed there. And yet we'll believe it when it comes to Jesus Christ. From Dan Brown's book. And he takes his stuff from these guys and guys like them. This is an original to Dan Brown. But a character in Dan Brown book says nothing in Christianity is original. Nothing. And these books have in common the idea that Jesus was not a historical figure. And we spent a lesson last week talking about how that's just not true. He was a historical figure. Believe what you want to about him, but the fact that he wasn't a historical figure is not true. He's not a myth. He wasn't a made-up person. He was real. But they have all this in common. Timothy Freak would say that he was not a real person. Now, I want to point out, you say, well, this is just fringe stuff. This isn't popular stuff. Their book, Freak and Gandy's book, was voted Book of the Year in 1999 by the London Daily Telegraph. I mentioned this last week. Well, when you vote something Book of the Year, that probably means it sold a lot of copies, number one. And there's a lot of people that read this and they just believe it. They believe the lie. Well, it's written in a book. And they will quote sources. The problem is the sources they're quoting are not good sources. So there's shoddy scholarship. They are pseudo-scholarship. They look like they're scholarship, but they're not. See, in the scholastic world, and you guys know all this, but if you write a book or if you write a paper, and you note that paper, and you got footnotes in that paper, and you say, I'm quoting from this person, that sounds good. But the problem is, if you're quoting from people that were wrong to begin with, it's still wrong. So that doesn't make it right, just because you say, well, look, I've got all these footnotes, and I've got all these quotes from antiquity and so forth. But maybe their stuff was wrong to begin with, wasn't accurate to begin with. If it's like I was a scientist and I was going to try to prove the flat earth or something, and I go out and I quote people that say, look, these are the evidences for the flat earth, and I got all these notations that say, look, it's a flat earth. I'm not me saying this. That still don't make it right. Very much these books are anti-Christian. I mean, that should be obvious. They're anti-Christian, anti-Christianity. Their scholarship is shoddy. It's not good. Don't believe that these are scholastic works. And most of the true scholastic people understand that. But even Bert Ehrman will quote people that he knows there's problems with. But it just looks good. And a lot of their stuff that they have has really no documentation at all. So I can say anything and lie about anything, not have any documentation for it, and it looks like the truth, but it's not. It's nonsense. So what do they claim? They claim, as I said, that Christianity borrowed from the pagan religions and then elevated Jesus Christ to a deity. And again, we're going to study whether or not Jesus claimed to be Christ in a couple of weeks, or to be the Son of God. But they say Christianity did this. It was after Jesus, or after the made-up Jesus, since you don't believe that Jesus lived. What would be the motivation for that? I have no idea. Why people would want to do that, why Christians would want to do that and go through all the persecution and die for it. That's, again, we've mentioned that before. Why would they do? These books don't answer that, by the way. They don't answer that. As far as I know, currently nobody's dying for Mithras or any of these other gods either, for that matter. And we're going to look at Mithras in particular because he's probably the most popular of these, because some of the rites and some of the titles that are given to him fit Jesus probably the most, because some of these other gods and so forth are clearly mythological, but Mithras is too, for that matter. But it's just some of these things fit him the most. He was called the Sun God, S-U-N, Sun God. He was the light of the world. Does that sound like Jesus Christ? He was originally a Persian god, a bucolic deity, which has to do with cattle and things like that, and he watched over cattle. Supposedly born on December 25th. He was born from a rock, by the way. He wasn't born from a person. He originated from a rock. So there was a mystical birth to him. There was a mystical birth to this mythological character, okay? He was buried in a rock and was resurrected on the third day. Does that sound like Jesus? And if you look at Mithras religion, it's a strange religion. We're not going to go into great detail, but it has to do with this, called him the bucolic god. It has to do with cattle and so forth. And there's this idea of the bull and the blood of the bull and a sort of quote unquote baptism. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in just a second. Another example is the Egyptian goddess Isis. And then some say it's her son, some say it's Osiris is her brother. So you have to interpolate some of this and make it try to fit Jesus, because most of the stuff that I read about Osiris is he's supposed to be Isis's brother. And I guess she could be nursing her brother if she had another child, but you'll see this statue of her, it's this Egyptian goddess nursing this baby. And of course, those that want to try to correlate these together and equate Christianity to Jesus Christ would make Isis the equivalent of Mary. And then Osiris was her son. And guess what? He was born on December 25th. And he was elevated to a god, and a god of Egypt. And there are many, many other examples of these so-called mystery religions. And you have a fellow by the name of Attis, Attis, and he was a Fijian god, and a Fijian god of vegetation. And he died and was resurrected. And he represents the fruits of the earth. And then you have Osiris, as we mentioned. Osiris was like god of the underworld, or the god of the afterlife, and responsible for resurrection. And if you were good, he could grant you resurrection in the afterlife. And so the gods, the kings of Egypt, the pharaohs of Egypt, that's what they were looking forward to. That's why in those pyramids they were buried with a lot of their possessions and so forth, because Osiris, who's the god of the afterlife, if they did good when he was resurrected, they would be resurrected too. You even have Adonis, who has been that has been equated to Jesus Christ. And Adonis was a god. He was worshipped by women. That's why the pictures of Adonis is always of a very handsome man and so forth. And he became sort of the god of imperial Rome for a while. Then you have Dionysus, who was Greek to begin with, and then was brought into the Roman mythology. And he was, in the Roman mythology, he becomes Bacchus. And he's god of the fertility in wine, and we have reference to him as far back as 1500 BC. He was also god of ritual madness, fertility, all this kind of stuff. And they try to equate that to Christ as well. And then we're going to look at the end of this lesson, a real person. First people we're going to look at: Mithras, Attis, Osiris, Adonis, Dionysus. These were all mythological. Nobody really believes they actually lived, but they just believe that Christianity borrowed from those myths to equate it to a real man, Jesus Christ. But there was a fellow by the name of Apollonius, and he's the one in your book. So if you read that, I think it's chapter 5, you would have read a little bit of Apollonius. We'll talk about him later. But there's all these, and they bring all these similarities, all these things that are very similar to what we read in our New Testament. And they say, again, New Testament Christians simply got this stuff together and made it fit one man, Jesus Christ. And the truth is, there's little evidence that any of these pagan religions existing in the forms described in these books existed before the mid-first century. And we got to see what they do. They want to carry some likenesses that may be similar, but forget everything else that is really obscure, has no relationship to Christianity, and just cherry pick what they want, so to speak, and then try to bring it into Christianity. And they do this after the mid-first century, after Christianity exists. They didn't believe that Mithras was born December 25th before Christianity. So if anything, what we see is that the pagans tended to borrow from the Christians in the mid-century, beginning in the mid-first century, after Jesus' life. But they flourished. They flourished, especially the Mithras religion, flourished in the mid-3rd century, 300 years after Christ. And here's, after reading about these gods, what you will see in these myths, what you'll see that they all have sort of in common. They have this annual vegetation cycle, kind of the 4 seasons, and then death, and then rebirth, and this whole cycle. They have that very much in common, like Adonis, the god of wine and so forth, and dying and then being resurrected, and then vegetation growing and all that. They have all that very, very much in common, very, very similar. They also have this concept of sort of what the Gnostics believed, and it's the esoteric acquiring of knowledge. And there's no idea of sin and remission of sin in any of these, really. It's more this, again, very much a Gnostic kind of concept where you acquire knowledge, and they have that very much in common as well. Emotional ecstasy. A lot of their rituals have to do with that, and we'll see that in the Mithras ritual that the initiates would do. And so their ultimate goal is really achieving a mystical experience. And these are very much in common with all these. So, Mithraism. It became the favored religion of the Roman legions between 100 and 400 A.D. In the book Dan Brown, he will mention the concept of Sol Invictus and how Mithras was the invincible son, this God, and very similar to Jesus Christ. What Dan Brown won't mention is that didn't happen until a couple of hundred years after Jesus Christ lived. He wasn't called that before that. He was made that afterwards. And this is the rite we were talking about. You may have seen movies that depict this, or TV shows. I've seen this on occasion, and it's the central rite, the central rite of Terabolium. And in that particular rite, now it may be hard to see, but that's a bull over a top that has like holes in it, and the initiate is underneath it. And so they slaughter the bull, a lot of blood involved here, and then the blood sprinkles down onto the person underneath. And that was their sequel, their rite, their central rite of initiating someone into the religion. And so what do they equate this with? Those that want to say that Christianity borrowed from them? Baptism. But does that look like baptism to you? You know, it's baptism, I guess, if you consider sprinkling baptism, but we know that's not what baptism is. Again, all this, though, the problem with it is the dating. This didn't occur until hundreds of years after Jesus Christ. So keep that in mind. The flowering of Mithraism occurred after the close of the New Testament canon. Too late to have influenced the development of first century Christianity. This is from Yumachi in The Case for the Real Jesus. You know, and say, why do I need to know this stuff? Maybe you don't need to know it, but you will probably run across it, especially you young people. Somebody's going to bring that up sometime in your life, that Christianity is just a borrowed religion, and that Mithras was the real, not the real Jesus, but that Jesus was modeled after Mithras. Now, Mithras predated Jesus. I understand that. But these rites and this Sol Invictus and this being born on December 25th all postdate Christianity, not predate it. And the same thing with some of these other myths. And this is what Yumachi says. All the mystery religions are repetitive. And when you look at these, and I spent some time last night looking at this, just go to Wikipedia and pull up some of these people, and you'll see this commonality to it. They're repetitive. They're symbolic of representations of death and rebirth of vegetation. It's paganism, that's what they are. And they were around during Jesus' time and well before that. The worship of Baal, you know, the other gods that the Old Testament talks about, yes, these religions have been around a long time, but they all have this in common. They are not historical figures. There are no historical figures, and none of their deaths are intended to prove salvation. That wasn't the purpose of their deaths. In the case of Jesus, even non-Christians, as we have pointed out many times, like Josephus and Tacitus and others, report that he died. He was a real person. He died under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. We know that from secular sources. The reports of his resurrection, well, there were eyewitnesses to that. There were people alive that saw that, and we pointed that out. So, many of their claims are so outlandish, and this is from Lee Strobel himself, like the author who likened the sinking of Osiris' coffin in the Nile to the Christian rite of baptism. How would you get that? How would you get that? It's outlandish. You know, how would you get that? But that's baptism. That's where the Christians got baptism. You see, Osiris was sunk in the Nile, and his coffin his coffin went down into it, and then he was resurrected. Now he said they would be laughable, and they are, if the damage they wrought wasn't so serious. There's people that believe this. There's people who believe a lot of crazy stuff. That don't make it right. Yes, sir.
Some people believe we never walked on the moon. Let me tell you, that is fraud.
Well,
I've talked to people. I listen to a man who actually walked on the moon. So, folks, that's a fraud.
Be a lot of cover up and lying if that was true.
There is not 1 ounce truth to that.
But you know, I did the radio show a few weeks ago called Coast to Coast. Well, I don't listen to that radio show, but if you ever do listen to it, there's some strange things out there that people still believe. They have people got on there speaking of flat Earth that believe flat Earth. Of course, they have the paranormal, and they have all these other extraterrestrial stuff and abductions and people that have been abducted. So people can believe what they want to believe, and they can believe anything. Just don't believe that it's based in truth. That's the point.
So what makes the most sense? That some character or individual magically pulled all these pieces together and all of a sudden became super popular, or the opposite? This significant event happened and is quoted from and talked about from secular sources, and then after that happened, other peoples and other societies copy pieces from this giant popular event.
That makes the most sense to me. I certainly agree with you. But these people writing these books, and I just mentioned a few of these books. There's a ton of them out there, and they permeate society. These are anti-Christian. Keep that in mind. They're not Christian at all. Either the people want to sell books, or they want to destroy Christianity, or they want to do both. And so you'll hear people on radio shows, and they'll start blabbering off. And one of the guys that called me that night, if any of you haven't listened to it, I still recommend you listen to it. He was spouting all some stuff that was absolute nonsense. Now, I had no time to sit there and refute that or rebut it. That wasn't even really the purpose. He was telling me that God only wrote one thing in the Old Testament. Only one thing was written by God. What would that be? Well, 10 Commandments. He did write that. Okay, we know he wrote that. But he's implying that all the rest of the Old Testament is just written by men, but we know that the men claim to be spokesmen of God. So people will bring this up and they'll rattle it off. Then they'll say, well, Mithras, Christianity just copied Mithras. That's all it did. Not realizing that there was very, very shoddy scholarship and wasn't true at all. You're right. But you look at what makes the most sense. That's what, and theirs does not. But nonetheless, people believe it. And as I say, Strobel says they would be laughable if their damage they wrought wasn't serious. Yet, in many cases, people are believing them. A great illustration of the old saying that falsehood can make a trip around the world before truth can even get its boots on. You ever heard that statement? Well, I have, and that's true. We can get a lie going around the world, and now it takes a lot now to start answering that lie, and before we can get the truth out there. So, these are arguments against the Christians' dependence on the mystery religions. And first of all, copycat proponents often illogically assume that just because two things exist side by side, one of them must have caused the other. Just because there may be stories of resurrection, or maybe some sort of rite of what someone might think is baptism, or anything else for that matter, to assume that because that's true, Christianity had to have gotten that from it. First, they got nothing from these, but what little similarity they may have gotten doesn't mean that the Christianity stole from that. And many alleged similarities are exaggerated or even outright fabricated. They're not true. Writers frequently use language borrowed from Christianity to describe pagan rituals, such as baptism, and then marvel at the parallels that they've discovered. Oh, wow, look at this. Well, you've attached a Christian name for a pagan rite. That's what you've done, not vice versa. But then you want to say, well, look at that similarity. The chronology is all wrong. Writers cite beliefs and practices that postdate the first century in an attempt to argue they influence first century information of Christianity. They got the dates all wrong. Doesn't matter. Trying to sell a book. And he points out, this comes from Lee Strobel's book, but he quotes Nash in that book from The Case for the Real Jesus. Paul would have never borrowed from pagan religions. Well, it would be absurd, or any other Christian writers for that matter. In fact, he would have warned against this very thing. They use the word syncretic, that number 5, early Christianity was exclusivistic. Any hint of syncretism in the New Testament would have caused immediate controversy. Most of these religions, you could be members of any of them, and you could be members of 2 or 3 of them at the same time if you wanted to. It didn't matter. They were so similar to each other. Mithras could also be followers of Adonis and Dionysus and so forth if they wanted to. That's not Christianity, though, is it? Christianity is very exclusive. Doesn't allow for that. Unlike the mystery religions, Christianity is grounded in historical facts, and what few parallels remain could reflect a Christian influence on the pagan beliefs and practices, not vice versa. So, how do you explain December 25th? I mean, these guys were born on December 25th. We all know that Jesus was born on December 25th, right? Well, of course not. That was not New Testament to say Jesus was born on December 25th. So they even got that wrong. So pagan attempts to counter the growing influence of Christianity by imitating it are clearly apparent. They're really just apparent. You have to look into a lot of stuff. How about Apollonius? Now, unlike Mithras, unlike Dionysus and Adonis and Midas and all these other guys, Apollonius was apparently a real person. They're not going to necessarily make that argument. And he lived at about the same time as Christ did. He was born, he died, I think, in AD 100. He was born in the early part of that century. He would have been a contemporary of Jesus. He is a historical figure. He's been known as Apollonius of Tyana. I had really never heard about Apollonius until I studied this stuff, but apparently a real figure. And there are lots of similarities. And I'm just going to go to my Wikipedia account here and read you the similarities between him and Jesus Christ. First, he was supposedly born miraculously and announced by God. He was religiously very precocious as a child. He is asserted to be a native speaker of Aramaic. He was influenced by Plato and reflected Platoism. I don't know how that's similar to Jesus, by the way, but that's what's listed in the Wikipedia here. He followed abstinence and asceticism. He liked wearing robes and long hair. Where do we get that? I mean, we get these pictures of Jesus that are fabrications to begin with, and yet this is a similarity. And it shows him with a robe and long hair there. He went to Jerusalem. He was anointed with oil. He spoke in metaphors, parables like Jesus. He saw and predicted the future. He performed miracles. He healed the sick. He cast out evil spirits, drove out demons, praised the daughter of a Roman official, Jewish official, and raised one from the dead, spoke as a lawgiver, was on a mission to bring Jewish culture to barbarians, believed to be Savior from heaven, was announced as being a magician, was accused of killing a boy. That one really threw me. When did Jesus kill someone? Am I missing something? I don't get that one. Was assumed to be, was assumed to have ascended into heaven, appeared posthumously to a detractor as a bright light, and has had his image revered in temples, just like Jesus has in churches. Well, of course, that's an adulteration of Christianity anyway. So all these similarities have nothing to do with New Testament Jesus for the most part. And this was supposedly what Apollonius did. So he said to heal people, exorcised demons, raised a young girl from the dead, appeared to his followers after his death. And this is what Greg Boyd says in your book. And he wrote a book called Cynic, Sage, or Son of God, Recovering the Real Jesus in the Age of Revisionist Replies. This is a 416-page book, and unlike those other books, is very well documented, very well annotated, and it stands up to scholarship. It's not, and he answers this. Boyd points out, let's look at the history of Apollonius, okay? Very little is known about Apollonius. In fact, virtually nothing is known, say for images on a coin or something, except what was written by this one man. And this is Philostratus. And when did he live? He lived 150 years after Apollonius. Would that make him an eyewitness? Well, of course not. He was not an eyewitness. He lived 150 years after the death. So his book was written, and he's really, hey, even Wikipedia will tell you that. This comes from a non-Christian source, I would say. Even Wikipedia will tell you that really, or any other source you want to go to, will tell you that this is really the only source we have of knowledge of this guy, is this one guy. So I'm going to quote Philostratus, and I'm going to say, see, it's real. How did he write his book on Apollonius to begin with? Well, he was commissioned by an empress who was dedicating a temple to Apollonius. If you're being paid money, commissioned, to write a book about someone that you are deified, are you going to say good things about him or bad things about him? Well, you're being paid to say good things about him, and you can make up anything you want. So he had a financial motive for what he wrote, to elevate Apollonius' status. And here's a key thing too. The New Testament doesn't say that Jesus supposedly raised the dead, or that he supposedly turned the water into wine, or any of the other miracles you could think of, healed the leper, healed the blind. Doesn't use words like that. In this book on Apollonius by Philostratus, the phrases are, it is reported that. Some say that. So when he raised the dead, for example, that in particular, some say that he raised the dead. That is a very those are tentative statements. Those aren't like he really did it. He wouldn't know anyway. He wasn't an eyewitness. And so keep in mind that Philostratus wrote in the early 3rd century of Cappadocia. Christianity was already there and would already have begun to be flourishing. So no doubt Philostratus would have known about Christianity and the things in the New Testament when he wrote this book. So similar to the mystery religions of Philostratus, it seems as if he borrowed from Christianity and not vice versa. There's no evidence at all that Christianity borrowed from this story of Apollonius. Now, he was an itinerant teacher. That's apparently what he did. And this was apparently also popular during that day. These philosophers, these teachers, would go around and they would spout out their philosophy. And we know that Paul went to the hill, what was it called, Mars Hill, and was talking to some of those people that would gather around and want to listen to these philosophers. And they listened to Paul on that day. Well, that's what Philostratus was. He was an itinerant teacher. And so I just want to emphasize, this is not mainstream stuff as far as Christians are concerned here, but when you start hearing some of this, now you understand that there's just no truth to it. Because when you first read those kind of statements, I mean, especially if there's any doubt at all, you'll say, wow, man, I didn't know that. I didn't know that all these other religions had this in common with Christ and Christianity, and that it does sound a little bit fishy that Christians have so many things in common with these other religions. Now you just know that's just not true. That's a great fabrication. It's an exaggeration. And what similarities are, the pagans have borrowed and put it into their religion and not vice versa. Any comments? Okay, so next week is going to be our study of Gnosticism. Reason I want to do that is, again, that's a very popular thing, that the Gnostics were, and first century Christians were kind of ecumenical. They kind of existed together, and that a lot of the writings of the Gnostics were considered equal to the Gospels, and that it was years later that they were finally just thrown out, that somebody decided on the canon, and they just decided that these books were not part of the canon, but yet at the beginning there were some 80 different works of the Gnostics, and they were considered all part of the New Testament canon. That's what people want you to believe. That's not true. We're going to look at that in a little bit of detail. Besides that, I believe that that Gnosticism, which had its roots early on in the 1st century, I believe that some of the things that Paul was writing against was the Gnostics of the time, and the Gnostics were trying to incorporate Christianity into their religion. So we're going to spend a week on that. If you want a source for that, my book, Unveiling the Da Vinci Code, and I forget which chapter it is, and there's some out on the foyer. That's where I've taken most of my stuff from, made it real easy for me to do, instead of going back and doing all the research all over again. And there's a chapter in there on the Gnostics, and if you wanted to read that you'd be prepared for next class. All right, thank you.